My guest today is returning to this podcast. If you have seen previous episodes, he was in both the Ancient Roads episodes, and he likes the word complicated. So, please welcome Erik Tiller. And the reason, if you haven't, if the episode is not clear, if the title of the episode is not clear, it's called Drunk History. That's because we're drinking tonight with alcohol, like grown-ups, real grown-ups do. And I just my first. How you been? How you been since the last time?
Well, we've been quite busy. We've continued trying to deal with this global pandemic, and thus much of the education of late has been in exactly this form, online, though with slightly less alcohol.
With I want to ask with all the situation, the pandemic and everything, you have been locked down and on Zoom recently.
Mm.
Do you find that the students that do have to do this through Zoom is easier to work with, or do you think you find them more or less that they're less paying less attention to class through Zoom?
Well, firstly, it depends on the form of the assignments and the topic. But the one thing that is missing out in the online teaching is the direct social interactions. You lose some of the spontaneity that you would otherwise have in a classroom.
But and I want to ask again with this pandemic going on, and we don't talk about this because the point of this podcast is mainly history, and we like to say that history repeats itself. That's a term that a lot of historians and I would say myself use as well. And with the pandemic, it's less than 100, almost 100 years ago now, almost less than 100 years that the Spanish flu happened, and this was during the World War as well as upon a global international pandemic. So, but don't you think, and with the Black Plague previous to that, so don't you think that with what a lot of the jobs should we have learned by now how to handle the situation, and don't you think a lot of history have indeed repeated itself when you look at how a lot of the governments have handled the situation that happened
Well,
last
we
year?
can divide this discussion into two. Firstly, how we've actually learned from previous pandemics. There are some examples there I can bring up, but also the entire idea of history repeating itself, because that is something that can throw most historians off on a rant, and that is exactly what's going to happen. Um, but of what we've learned from previous pandemics, we can start with the Black Plague. Um, One of the main measures that have been used against the current pandemic has been the quarantine. And that is something that stems from the Italian experience with the plague, especially in Venice, where they had designated islands where they actually isolated people who brought the plague to the city. They were supposed to be there for 40 days, hence the term quarantine. So some of the measures that we are using today stem from that initial, or not initial, but from the experience with the Black Plague.
Because that's where
But
quarantine comes from, right? The word
mm,
quarantine is Italian and comes from the Black Plague,
mm,
when shippers had to quarantine for 2 weeks in
yeah,
Italy.
yeah, and some of those facilities were quite impressive. Not only did they isolate the people, but they also scoured the entire ships. In one of the cases, they even constructed an entire shipyard to take the ships apart and then put them back together after cleaning it. So some of the measures were in place quite early.
But again, I wanted because when I studied a little bit, not studied in the way you study history, but I want just looked it up more or less. And what I found was back in 1918 that
Mm.
governments really downplayed how dangerous the Spanish flu is. And we see this again with the COVID-19, that the governments downplays. No, it's not dangerous. It's just normal flu. It's not. You're not gonna die of this. It's not. It's not as dangerous as it really is. So don't you see the history repeating itself there? Don't you see that?
Well, I see a certain pattern that repeats itself, namely that it differs from country to country. The situation at the end of the First War was, of course, that the press was under quite heavy restrictions in what they could publish, mostly to avoid ruining the morale back home at the home front. So when the pandemics first started to spread, one of the considerations was that, all right, we've just been through a devastating war. Let's not cause even more, what should we say, bad feelings on the home front. Let's try to make sure that people keep the morale up. Interestingly, that is where the name the Spanish flu comes from, because the Spanish press did not have the same restrictions, meaning the Spanish press was the first press where this, what should we say, outbreak was reported. Thus, people started associating it with Spain. It did not begin in Spain. That is not why we call it the Spanish flu. We call it the Spanish flu because the Spanish press was the first to actually report on it.
Right. And that's a little bit about the modern history and repeating history. But I don't think we went into this last time. What is your main profession when it comes to history? What is your main study? And why did you choose history as an academic profession?
Well, I actually find history to be one of the greatest studies in how human beings actually work. Because history as a discipline is the amassed human experience. It's all the case studies of what do people do in given situations. Sometimes they act well as expected, while in other cases they do things that are quite unexpected. And that brings us into what we mentioned about history repeating itself, because most historians will actually tell you that it does not repeat itself. And I can explain this. This is sort of an example that most people know about in Scandinavia, the play by Ludwig Holberg, Erasmus Montanus. In that play, there's this famous segment where the protagonist, Erasmus, who has been studying rhetorics and argumental theory, claims that his mother cannot fly and a stone cannot fly. Hence, his mother is a stone, because both have the same qualities. That, in terms of rhetoric, is what we call a false analogy, because we only look at the similarities, but we disregard all the differences. And that is the case in many instances where we claim that history repeats itself, because we can see a lot of similarities. But most of the things, for instance, the backdrop, the causes that led up to that point, are quite different. But what we can see is that certain patterns of human behavior can repeat itself. For instance, one of the most dangerous elements that we can see in history is a dissatisfied working class. We've seen that, for instance, in Germany in the years
I want
prior.
to ask you about this because do you think it's fair to compare Trump to Hitler as many does? Do you think it's fair to compare him to like the same qualities that Hitler had, because the working class is obsessed with the rich folks, and Trump is we're gonna make America great again. We're going to make working class worth it again, etc. Do you think it's fair to compare Trump to Hitler?
Well, yes and no. Again, this is about the analogy thing. And I actually had this discussion with my history class this very week, where we were working with the ideology, the ideas behind fascism. And the main question the students asked is Trump a fascist? And here again, it's complicated. Here we go. But
you can drink every time you said complicated.
Yeah, I will. But my point here is that Trump is not a political thinker. He does not have any core ideology. If we were to describe him, he's an opportunist, a narcissistic opportunist, but not a fascist, because he's not that into the heavy political ideology. However, many of the qualities that he professes, for instance, the disdain for weakness and the admiration for strength, for greatness, and also the very heavy ethnocentric nationalism, those are traits that we find within fascist ideology.
Do you think he preys on the so-called weak people like Hitler did? He preyed upon the weak people because of
if you look at
Hitler knew that the people after Versailles, the Treaty of Versailles, that people were not happy. They were, because their economy were failing. He knew that they could prey upon the weak people of Germany.
Well, that is not the same weakness, but what I'm talking about here is the disdain for weakness and the celebration of strength. If you look at his rhetoric throughout his entire presidency and even before the presidency, whenever he is in opposition to someone, he immediately calls them weak. And he also tries to cultivate this image of himself as strong. That alone does not make him a fascist, but those are parts of the fascist ideology. So while Trump himself is not a fascist, much of what he represents are qualities that makes him attractive to people who are more into fascist ideologies.
And I want to ask you about this, because if anyone has, if this happened a few years ago, so if anyone's seen Joe Rogan, of course, most 90% of people have. And he had it just a while ago, and it's been a few times now. He's called Brett Weinstein, not to be compared to Harvey Weinstein, but he has seen more. He was condemned by his fellow students, not fellow students, but by his students, because he's deemed a racist, and this caused more to the term of kidnapping in the school. If I would like to call it kidnapping, because that's more or less what it was, because it's a woke ideology today. And I want to ask, do you think, because we both live in Norway and we both live in more or less cozy homes compared to America, we both have freedom, speech, we all both enjoy qualities that most Americans don't. But do you see this thing that happened at Evergreen University happen in Norway?
No, not really. And the core of that is that the American experience is quite different from Norwegian ones. I will come into that very soon. But first of all, the, what should we say, triggering event was, of course, this day which was supposed to mark support for the Black students, that all those of a different color should keep away from campus. What I think was the mistake they did there was that that sort of activity is not uncommon in, for instance, sociology classes. The mistake was that they expanded it to the entire campus. But I see the point that they try to make, but they try to make it in a very crude manner. Because the same thing has been done in sociology classes, but they expanded it to a scale where people miss the point of it. And that, of course, caused inflammatory feelings on both sides. But as for the American experience, there is something unique about it. Just a moment.
Cheers.
I need a drink before getting into this because the core of this is the American slavery. And what I mean about that is the uniqueness of the American slavery. Now, slavery has existed for many, many years. It's been a part of many ancient societies. But the American slavery is distinct for one particular reason. And that is because the status as a slave was linked to race and not to social standing. If we compare throughout the history, if we look at, for instance, the Roman slavery, um, people of any creed or any kind of people from across the Roman Empire or even beyond the Roman Empire could become a slave. But also,
It's just a matter of conquest.
yeah, but any slave could also be freed and become a Roman citizen. That was a possibility. Compared to the Norse thraldom, keeping thralls. The same thing can be said there. They did not discriminate on who they took as slaves, but they also kept the door open for granting those slaves their liberties. The same can be said in the Arab or the Muslim slavery along the coast of North Africa.
I want to touch about
Yeah,
Muslim
yeah. They
ideology
did not. Yeah, but let me finish this argument.
first.
They did not really care whether the slaves came from the inner parts of Africa or if they were people from the east or if they were captured sailors from the north. To them, the slavery depended on social status. And again, there were ways out of slavery. You could be bought out of slavery, or you could simply convert to Islam and then no longer be a slave. The common trait here is that slavery was a social status, not something directly linked to the race. But when we come to the American slavery, we see that slavery becomes inadvertently linked with the race,
This
not
is
just in
this
who
is
were the slaves, but also in that measures were put in place to prevent slaves from being freed. Everything from heavy taxation on freeing slaves to laws that actually made it possible to enslave freedmen who were in certain states for a certain time. And that is sort of the legacy that's still not been resolved in the US.
I just
Namely,
just see that with the George Floyd case that happened
Mm.
last year.
Yeah, that is just one of a long string of examples. And that link between slavery and race, which is a uniquely American experience, is something that's still a, what should we say, dividing issue in the US today. And that is also what makes sort of the American experience unique, in that it cannot truly be compared to slaveries that have occurred in other civilizations across the world, even those that were contemporary, like the North African slavery, which was ongoing at the same time as the American slavery. Yes, both were slavery, but if you look at the core of it, those were two different entities.
Right. And I want to ask because I feel like having I'm just recently started more or less not studying in the same way you do, but study history in
Mm.
more detailed manner. And I find I think most white people in the West view Islam as this backwards religion where people don't think that Islam is this totally controversial religion. But I don't think that's the thing at all because you see, if you follow history like you and me, like me recently, and you have studied it a long time. I think Islam is one of the most forgoing and understanding because Islam is one of those that actually accept other religions and they're curious about other religions and there are fantastic astronomers as you can see in the Arabic religions. And what do you think make Islam this is because of radical Islamists? Do you think that that's kind of ruined the Islamic reputation, if you will?
Well, here we have to look at several different points in time. Firstly, the late 70s or the 70s overall, not just in the Middle East, but also further to the east, for instance, Afghanistan. And what was happening in the Islamic world at that time was an overarching process of secularization. But that led to a major religious backlash, which paved way for more extremist, what should we say, branches of the religion. And another thing that we should mention when it comes to at least the Middle East is that we are, just like with many parts of Africa, looking at a post-colonial situation. Because what's not really known to many who haven't studied history is that after the First World War, despite the promises to the Arab leaders, the Middle East was basically taken as a colony. Now they called it a protectorate, but
Britain basically screwed Arabic countries over.
Yeah, they called it a protectorate, though it was basically a colony, only they didn't call it that because the word colony was a bit iffy even at that point.
Yeah, we all know.
And what they did was that they drew new borders in the region, just like they had done in Africa in 1884.
Straight lines dividing family, dividing culture.
So they did a Berlin Conference version 2 on the Middle East. And what that resulted in was that many groups within that region who otherwise were in disagreement were now clustered together within the same borders. And when the British and the French eventually left the area, those conflicts remained and it became an internal power struggle. So many of these areas where we see conflicts and we blame it on religion, the religion is not the issue. The issue is that these areas are the subject of a post-colonial reality in which the state-making process has not been done thoroughly. As a result, we see many armed conflicts, and this is just the sort of environment that both causes some parties to become more radicalized, but it also means that those radicalized groups have the room to thrive. It is not the kind of stable society that would otherwise prevent those radical directions. And when people think of Islam, they of course think about the Middle East, but most Muslims actually live in Southeast Asia. So the perception that most Westerners have of Islam as this brutal, warlike religion mostly stems because the region in which most are familiar with Islam being the main religion has been left in such a state due to the post-colonial experience. And again, this brings us into the topic of narratives and perception. For instance, the opposition to the establishment of Israel in that area. We may see the Arab opposition to it as an example of anti-Semitism, but to the, what should we say, Arab parties, that would be more an opposition to yet another example of Western colonization in the area.
Right.
That they suddenly placed a new nation with new borders in the middle of an area without consulting them. So that would, for them, just be a continuation of the colonialism that we saw after the First World War.
And I think that when you look at especially the Ottoman Empire, I think the only reason the Hagia Sophia is still existing today is because Mehmed II was so awed by the church that he turned into a mosque, and I think I respect tremendously a lot the Ottoman Empire because they still respected the religion. They were unlike Christianity at the time. They still respected religion, that you could still have your religion, your belief, but you could of course not be a part of the government, but you were still able to have your religion, and I think that's one of the saddest things that we see today, that religion is Christianity is this good guy, and Islam and everything else, and all the others religion is the bad guy in a sense in Western Europe or in the Western world. That we don't, I don't think we teach enough of the other religions in school to learn that the other religions aren't bad. They just, but yeah, I think that's one of the most misconceptions of history that we know. I want to know what you think about this.
Well, I've also been teaching in religion in school, so I can assure you that we do look into all of these facets of the religion, both how they share some certain common course, but also how religion in any form can become radicalized. And that the radicalization is not essentially a core of the religion itself, but very often external circumstances. But I'm glad you mentioned the Ottoman Empire, because that is sort of a good entry point to understanding how we present history. And that is the narrative. History is a narrative. You can ask any historian and they will tell you the same. We have all these facts and figures, like this many people lived in that area for that long time, and they paid this and that much in taxes, but that is not history. It becomes history when we put it all together into a certain narrative. And that is often where the misunderstandings show up. And one of the greatest examples of how a narrative can be both shaped and also falsified
History
is,
is written by a winner, isn't it?
yeah, not just that, but also in what you include. You probably heard about the siege of Vienna,
Yeah.
the siege that also inspired the very
The Ottoman
right-wing extremist page, The Gates of Vienna.
Ottoman Empire siege. Yeah.
Yeah. And I often use that as a good example to show how narratives can differ depending on what you include. Now, if we look at the siege of Vienna, was the attacking force, the Ottomans, predominantly Muslim? Yeah. Were the besieged and also the relief force from the Christian band mostly Christian? Well, yeah, they were. And so far, at this point, it adds up to the narrative that this was a great war between Christians and Muslims. But then we need to look at who it was that financed, who actually paid for the Ottoman campaign. And that was Catholic France. And suddenly the entire narrative of Christians versus Muslims fall apart, because the campaign against the Christian city was paid for by other Christians.
Speaking of Christian, I want to address something, and I think that we all learn history, especially from my school. We learn that this like Christians, yay, the Crusades, yay, that we're going to take back Jerusalem, yay. But when you look at it from a different historical perspective, it was all a mistake. The Crusades were a mistake. So how do you feel about the Crusades personally? In my opinion, it was more or less a mistake because if you remember the emperor of the Byzantine Empire, he just wanted just a few thousand people, but instead the Pope sent 100,000 troops back to Jerusalem and back to the Middle East. So how do you feel about the Crusades personally?
Well, I think, again, the Crusades are misunderstood. Yes, there was the religious fever that made people go there and slay the heathens, as they would profess it. But the same thing that we see with the Siege of Vienna is something that we can see in the Crusades, namely that you also use these major religious movements as pieces in grand politics. For instance, we all know of the sack of Constantinople by the Crusaders. I think it was during the Fourth Crusade. And that is similar to what we see with the Siege of Vienna, where the Ottoman force is backed up financially by Catholic France. And that is a struggle between different parties within Europe. In the case of Constantinople, it was between the east and the west, or the eastern and western part of the Roman Empire, or the former Roman Empire at that point. And with the siege of Vienna, we have the struggle between France and the Habsburger Empire, who at that point were basically surrounding France in terms of territories. So while there's a certain religious element to it, we can't disregard that there are also dynastic elements to it.
I don't know if you've seen that. Did you listen to the episode where I had about the Byzantine Empire when I had episodes? The one right after you were on?
No, I haven't had the time for that.
Because the guy that I had on, I think if I'm sorry if anyone listening or listen to the episode that were on about the Byzantine Empire, I apologize if I misquote right now. But he had a theory that the modern West, did not begin until the Renaissance, and the Renaissance is all because the Byzantine Empire, the Crusades again, because the West were and the Crusade robbed Constantinople and the West, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, etc. All these religious cities. And we talked about this yesterday, but I want your opinion on this podcast. What do you think about this, that the Renaissance is all because of the Crusades and all because the robberies and that the modern West did not begin until the Renaissance? What do you think about this?
Well, I both agree and disagree. Again, here we go. It's complicated.
Let's talk the chair, Smith.
Firstly, that the Renaissance started modern Europe. Culturally, it did, but politically, we need to go back further, and that is to the state-making process in the High Middle Ages. If you look at a map of Europe in the 1100s, you can see quite a few familiar names. You can see Norway, you can see Sweden, you can see Denmark, you can see England, you can see France, you can see Spain. All of this is because these countries underwent a certain state-making process that is actually quite easy to identify and which also overlaps. You can see, for instance, that after the civil wars in Norway, that the Sverre dynasty actually used many of the methods of King Philip II of France in order to shape the Norwegian experience. So the political Europe as we know it, at least Northwestern Europe, begins in the early thousands with the medieval state-making process. But culturally, what we've come to know as European culture has more to do with the Renaissance. Now, what triggered the Renaissance? That's an interesting question. And again, wow, this is going to hurt my liver. It's complicated. But it was about several factors coming together at the same time. Constantinople certainly had a part to play in it, not due to the Crusades, but due to the siege of Constantinople and the, fall of it, which led many of the craftsmen of Constantinople to flee west to Italy. But they wouldn't have had sort of, what should we say, a fertilized ground in which to thrive if it wasn't for another development that had happened in the late Middle Ages, and that was the expansion of trade networks. And this is not just something that happened to the Italian states, it's also something we can see elsewhere in Europe. We can see the early rise of the Dutch areas, the Netherlands, and we can also see it in northern Germany with the German hansa. So we have this.
Hans came from East Asia, didn't it? Yeah, Hans came from East Asia, didn't it?
Not the Hans, but the Hansa. German Hansa.
Oh, sorry, my mistake. I missed it.
Yeah, because all those are examples of expansive trade networks and trade organizations. And that is something that's developing independently of what's happening in Constantinople. But with all the craftsmen and all the expertise fleeing Constantinople and landing in Italy in this environment of economic growth. That is sort of the mixture that makes sort of the Renaissance come to be.
Yeah, right. I want to ask you a little bit different question now. What is your favorite historical movie that's been made?
My favorite historical movie. That's a
movie or TV show. Movie or TV show.
That is sort of a difficult one because I'm sort of an omnivore there. One that I particularly like is A Royal Affair, which chronicles the Struense era in Denmark between 1770 and 1772. Of course, the film is marketed as this romantic drama, but what it's in fact about is about the first attempt to take the ideas of the Enlightenment and putting them into political practice. Of course, Struens did it in such a manner that he ended up getting executed, but this is sort of the precursor to the revolutions that we see in later years. And while there are some flaws to the movie, there are also many things to get right. And you can clearly see that the filmmakers were asked to make this big romantic period drama, but they wanted to focus on the political aspect because many of the decrees that we can see are downright exact copies of the ones that were made during the period. I've been to the archive in Copenhagen, actually seen the originals. So it's quite fun to see how they actually translated this political movement under Dr. Struens.
Just keep talking, I'll be right back. Just keep talking.
Well,
just
be right back as well.
I'll be right back. This is wrong history. I apologize for that. I just had to take a piss break. I'm back now. It's okay. This is Drunk History. I'm back. And yeah, he seems to be out at the moment. I just had to take a piss break. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But yeah, I don't know where he is right now. There you are. I just had to take a piss break. I mean, I've been drinking beer for the last half hour.
So, well, just the same.
This is July. I'm not the
Good coordination.
That is another thing. This is Drunk History, mate. I just yeah, but like yeah, what was it? Was you talking about the Danish movie?
Yeah, The Royal Affair. That's a fairly good movie if you want to understand the first major attempt to introduce the ideas of the Enlightenment. But other movies and shows that like is, for instance, Barry Lyndon and also HBO's Rome.
I actually want to point out that my personal favorite, and it's one that came out this year.
Yeah.
If you've seen Netflix Barbarians.
I have seen the Barbarians.
Oh, I love that. That's a fantastic show. It's a TV show, but it's fantastic. And I really respect the director because usually you see that Romans have this British, fine, posh British accent. But one of the reasons I respect the series so much, and I want to do an own episode about the series and about the events that happened during that time, because the actors actually went the length to learn Latin, and it sounds like legit Latin to me, because I haven't studied Latin language or anything, so I can say, but for me, that they actually went the next step to talk Latin language, that was just mind-blowing to me, and it was just wow. That's one of the reasons it's one of my favorite historical dramas at the moment.
Yeah. And I did mention Barry Lyndon and Rome. While there are certainly some things that can be critiqued, uh, both that movie and that show does something that many people try to avoid when it comes to making historical drama, and that is giving the characters the mindset of the period. I can vividly recall when my mother stumbled across Rome on television.
Oh,
She was shocked because, as she said, they are all terrible people. And, yeah,
to
well, that's the Roman mindset for you. They were actually quite terrible people.
be fair, though, that I can't seem to remember his name right now. I've been drinking. To be fair, Nero did try to kill his mother. To be fair, so it makes
And
sense that they're terrible people.
and it's the same you can see in Barry Lyndon. That yeah, these are terrible people, but they, in many ways, reflect the mindset of that time, and that is something that many historical dramas shy away from. That they sort of inject very modern values into their protagonists to make them more edible to the audience. Uh, but in the end, it only distracts from the very ideas of that period.
How do you feel? Speaking of Rome, how do you feel about Gladiator? We touched briefly about this in the last episode that you were on.
About what?
Gladiator with Russell Crowe, and how do you feel about it personally? I know it's
Uh,
a historical accurate movie, but how do you feel about it?
as a movie, it's high craftsmanship. You have good acting, and one thing I like about Gladiator is the structure. It is among those very few near perfectly structured movies. Um, but it's not a historical movie. It should have ended with Joaquin Phoenix and Russell Crowe in a bathtub. But as a movie on its own, it's very entertaining and it's very well made. Despite being well, a bucket load of historical inaccuracies, not just in the events, but also in the equipment and the tactics and everything.
Also,
But
the Gladiator battles as well.
so when it comes to historical movies and television, you need to be aware of what you're watching. Are you watching something that tries to depict the area as it was, or if it's something that's made for entertainment?
But one thing I want to ask: when you studied history, what surprised you the most? Like something that wow, that's mind blowing. What was the most surprising thing about the study when you studied history more?
What really surprised me was I need to prepare the battle. How complicated things were. Going into archives from the 1700s, it was very surprising how advanced these people actually were. That is something, a term that's often used, and that's chrono-racism. The idea that people back in the good old days were just blatantly stupid and believe that yeah, leprechauns would come and eat their socks. But that's not the case. If you look at things that have been written all the way from antiquity and up to modern times, you see that the old societies in many ways were just as complicated and advanced as ours. So, and that means when you go into study history, you should never underestimate the people of the past because their brain capacities were pretty much just the same as ours. And when you look at the sources, not just the secondary sources in form of history books, but the first-hand sources, things that they wrote, you can clearly see that these were quite intelligent people. And at times you can actually be quite surprised in their insights and their ingenuity.
And yeah, but something else. Actually, when I read, I don't know if you read the book, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William L. Shriver. which I highly recommend if you haven't, because it's an amazing book. And
I
what
haven't read it, but Nazi Germany is sort of something you should know if you've studied history.
right? Yeah, but what surprised me was that there was surprisingly a lot of politics involved when Germany tried to involve Austria and Czechoslovakia into the Reich. That it was surprisingly a lot of politics in that was involved in the siege. It wasn't just like as we when I was in secondary school, what we taught were basically that they caused a lot of trouble in Austria. They were welcome in Austria, and that they just basically waltzed over. But that's not the case. There was a lot of politics involved, and I think that's some of the things that surprised me the most when I read the book, and it was just wow.
Yeah, and again, that is something I talked about with my students this very week, is that most people think of the fascists and the Nazi party as the outliers of Europe at that time. But actually, authoritarian regimes were the norm in the interwar years in Europe. The democracies actually became a minority in that period.
But
So,
this is kind of a dumb question, but
yeah.
do you have a favorite empire, like favorite and one of your, or do you have a weakness when it comes to studying history? What is your passion when it comes to it?
Well, I am sort of a historical omnivore. You often end up being that when you teach in school. But one of the things that fascinate me the most is the Habsburger Empire. Just in how large it became, not just by conquest, but simply by intermarriage. Of course, that led to some other issues like interbreeding. For instance, you have the Habsburger chin, which is sort of the genetic defect that even rednecks can't achieve. But the way they became a very dominant force in Europe is quite impressive. And also that they are mostly disregarded when we think about big empires. We think about those that were forged through conquest. But the Habsburg Empire was forged through close political and marital connections, and that sort of made them go under the radar. But even so, they controlled a fairly vast portion of Europe.
I think for me, it's if you would have asked me a year ago, it would have been ancient. The answer would have been ancient Rome. Just I was there in I think 2017. I just touching the walls of Colosseum was amazing, and just being watching Pompeii and this fallen city, these fallen cities was amazing. And learning about them, but I would say now it's the Ottoman Empire because I'm just fascinated by that empire, and I have tremendous amount of respect for the empire because they had so much respect for other religions as well, as not just that it was not just Islam or die. Not like at least in I don't know how it went in the rest of Europe, but in Norway, as you know, it was either be Christian or die.
Yeah.
But the Christian, but Ottoman Islam was not like that at all. They were curious and they were fascinated by other religions.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons I respect the Ottoman Empire so much.
Yeah. Speaking of that, there was this video on YouTube a few months ago that asked the questions: why wasn't there any crusades to the Scandinavian countries? Because we know one of the first crusades was against the Baltic states to convert the heathens there by the Teutonic Order. And the video asked, well, why didn't this happen in Scandinavia? And the reason for this is the process of christening in Norway and Sweden, which was quite brutal. Same in Denmark. So while it didn't happen in the form of crusade, many of the same methods that you see in a crusade were utilized.
And I want to ask, how do you feel? I wanted to ask you about the Japanese Empire because that's another thing I want to read that I just recommended. Actually, I was talking to a previous guest was on when we talked about the Cold War, James Pelfrey, and he recommended this book called "The Sun: The Rise of the and Fall of the Japanese Empire." And while they very much are what I would regard the villain of the story, you don't respect them so much. Respect them because they did come from an what do you call it? They weren't civilized, if you would call it that way. They came from an uncivilized civilization to being one of the most industrialized countries in the world. Because they were built by the United States, of course, but you still don't respect them from being nothing in a sense, becoming this world domination power.
Yeah.
Well, how do you feel about the Japanese Empire yourself?
That is again a topic that I've been working with my students on, namely, how do we perceive the Japanese Empire? And first, we need to understand where it came from. If we are to understand the Japanese experience, we need to understand the Chinese experience. Because the Chinese were basically chopped to bits by all the Western colonial powers. And when the Americans then arrived in Japan, we got this counter-reaction in form of the Meiji reforms. I like to think that those reforms were highly inspired by just having observed the Chinese experience, that these people came to their country and they picked it apart. So the way the Japanese avoided the same fate as China was to industrialize and basically mimic the Western powers, for good and bad. The Japanese have often been characterized as very brutal in their approach. But if you look at the colonial history in both India and in China, you can see that what the Japanese are doing is basically mimicking the European approach to imperialism.
Because if you read history, you know that industrialization is the key to any success in economical development in a country.
Yeah, the Japanese industrialization is quite unique in how fast it happened. But most people just say, yeah, they industrialized like the West and well, that's it. But no, their methods of imperialism, the brutality in which they are often branded with later, is just the same brutality that you see that the European powers display time and time again in Asia. So again, calling the Japanese inherently brutal in the imperial circumstances becomes sort of, well, a reflection of ourselves, because they were simply doing the same thing that the European powers had already been doing for 50 years in the same area.
Right.
For instance, the European culling of the Taiping Rebellion in China, the death toll, by some estimates, these are not certain estimates, but by some estimates, are nearly double those of the First World War. So what we are seeing is that the Japanese did not only get inspired by the European industrialism, but also the European imperialism in all its brutality. So how can we conclude about that is that the brutality that we see from Imperial Japan is basically just a reflection of the brutality that the Europeans had imposed in Asia in the decades prior. And that is sort of an uncomfortable truth that most people shy away from mentioning.
And I think we basically covered quite a lot in this episode. And I want to thank Erik for coming back. It was really a fun episode because we both been drinking, we both been under the influence, I suppose. And thank you so much for coming and being back. This has been That Aged Well, and my name is Alan, and we are on Instagram under Well That Aged Well. And do you have anything you want to promote on social media you want to add to the podcast? I can put it in the description below.
Nothing that I would promote, but if you are interested in history, try to look for the more uncomfortable parts and try to get the whole picture. History is complicated.
But thank you so much for coming back, and you're always welcome back to the podcast. It's good to have a drink, and I hope we get to do this live someday when it's possible, when COVID does not restrict our means. And this has been Well Done H1. My name is Alan. I see you next. Please like, share, subscribe. I see you next time. Thank you very much.